when you're going through or having had gone through a time of failure or disappointment or going through a difficult transition, to perhaps understand that to achieve is not necessarily get to the other side. To achieve is actually what's the best thing, what's the best lesson that I can learn from this single experience the most that I can carry forward for the rest of my life that's going to be incredibly valuable to me, but be something that I can use to encourage others.
Around the Table is an Illuminaire podcast hosted by John Healy and me, Karise Hutchinson. This podcast is powered by New Eda, developing the next generation of leaders. For over 2 decades, New Eda has partnered with the world's leading financial institutions and technology firms to build the skills, mindsets, and confidence their people need to lead in a digital world. From early career engineers to senior executives, their expert-led training programs help organizations accelerate transformation, adopt AI, and deliver real business impact. Learn more at neweda.com.
Well, hello and welcome to this edition of our Around the Table podcast. And it's absolutely fantastic to be back here. And actually, for the word for today's conversation on failure. And failure is such a difficult word, Karise. And whenever I was thinking about the series, thinking about the words, I actually worried that we wouldn't actually get somebody who would come and talk about failure, because although we live in this world where we talk about change all the time, it's very difficult for people to talk about failure, to hear those real stories about where change, and that's in people's personal lives or professional lives, very difficult for people to tell stories, because often, and I know this myself from my career, is that you get to a point in your career and you don't experience failure, and then it hits you. Because if there's one thing that's certain, is that we'll all encounter failure at some time. But we have got a fantastic guest who has come and is going to tell us his story and talk to us and have that conversation around failure. And I am really looking forward to that. So we've got Glenn Williams, and Glenn's actually joining us down the line from Australia. And we're going to hear from Glenn in a moment. And Glenn has had a successful career in business and has now set up his own company, LCP Global, and that's been going now for 15 years, back in 2010. And his own personal story, it really encourages leaders not to be afraid of sharing their whole story. You know, and in an Instagram age where everybody is all about that perfect picture, that's a very difficult thing for leaders to do. So I am so excited about hearing from Glenn. But before we do, Karise, can you talk to us a bit about this word and give us a definition on the word failure?
Certainly. It is a weighty word, John, and I've been reflecting a lot and doing a bit of research into this. And I think whenever we do look at our news headlines, nothing sells more than bad news and a high profile leadership failure when it hits our headlines. And I think what happens around this word is that we assume that the result is because of a dark personality trait or a character flaw, or even in terms of poor performance. And we do have a lot of examples of that, but actually there's much more to leadership failure. So a couple of things just to be clear before we dive into the conversation. First of all, not all failures are created equal. They are different. The second point is that good leaders also fail. And then thirdly, we can't ignore the unexpected reasons where failure happens, and there's other kind of organizational or environmental contexts at play. So we're talking about it as, yes, inevitable, but we're also very clear it is not a full stop in the story of a leader, that it is a comma on the journey. And it's about embracing the necessity of the process. We actually all need it to some degree, John, but we can't stop there. So,
Chris, I love that. I love this idea that it's a comma and not a full stop. And maybe that's where people come unstuck, is that they think failure
it's the
brings
end of the road
to an end. And again, this idea that not all failures are equal. and it's by feeling small.
Yeah.
You hear it in Agile, feeling fast,
Hmm.
that people learn.
Yeah.
And I'm sure as we get into this conversation with Glenn, we'll hear, well, how do you do that and do that well? So I'd like to welcome you, Glenn, to the conversation around the table today on failure. You're most welcome. We're sitting here. It's about 4 degrees outside, and I can hear the rain. Hopefully, you podcast listeners can't hear the rain. Can hear the rain bouncing off the ceiling. But you're on the Sunshine Coast in Australia.
Well, thanks, John, and thank you, Karise. Great to be here. And yes, it's still summer here. Well, just no, summer's just finished, hasn't it? So no, it hasn't. Still on. It's 29 Celsius here, 7 o'clock in the evening. So that's what
Lucky,
it's
lucky you.
live on this.
What else? What else could be better than a sunny evening time? So I think you're closer to a nice glass of wine than we are. Glenn, we've asked
Yeah.
all of our guests to bring with them an object or a book, or to think about a piece of art or music that has meant something to them on their leadership journey and has some sort of relation to the word that we're having a conversation about around the table. So I am very keen to hear, what have you brought along for us?
Well, John, I've brought along a photo, and it's 27 years old. It has my mother and father in it, and my first son. And it's taken. My mother was not well; she had terminal cancer, and in fact, I got a call one night. I was visiting her in hospital. I got a call from my wife saying, "I'm in labor. Come to the hospital." And so I went to the hospital and saw my wife give birth to Ben, which was my first child at that time. And so you can imagine the extremity of emotions at that point,
Mm.
leaving your mother unwell in one hospital to go and be present at the birth of your son in another hospital.
Wow.
Wow, that's a pretty poignant object. Fantastic. Thanks very much for sharing that with us. You have a long career in business. You've got your own business now, a consultancy. You're a psychologist by background. Do you want to just give us a bit of your story and tell us why you want to talk to us today about this word failure?
Sure. No, thank you. I started. I was a high school dropout. Not probably the way that most people would think about starting a successful career, but dropped out of school at the age of 16. But fortunately enough, worked for a Japanese company in sales and did that for almost 10 years. And then went back to university later to study to be a psychologist. And in studying to be a psychologist, and from that started a number of other businesses, including working with a number of charities in the area of youth homelessness and drug education, family mediation, and then went and started another nonprofit organization to work with families. And I think really the motivation of that, John, was seeing that homelessness and youth issues that I was encountering on a day-to-day basis with the families that I was seeing, that often these issues were very real for lots and lots of people, and yet many people wouldn't be seen dead walking into a counselor or going to a church or a welfare, counseling agency for help. And so I thought, well, is there a different way we can tackle these issues? And so with that, I started a business and a consulting business, and went into businesses to provide training programs, looking at the impact of relationships, how to develop healthy relationships, how to relate to each other, developing interpersonal skills, how not to take your work home and let that negatively impact your family. So went down a very different track, and through that, obviously was exposed to lots of issues, but had the privilege really of working with lots of men and women in leadership who often found it very difficult to talk about a lot of the issues that they were experiencing at home, and vice versa. They'd go home and didn't feel like they could talk about some of the issues that they were experiencing, in the workplace. And so it gave me an opportunity to build that bridge and to give them the skills to be able to tackle both of those areas that sometimes seem to be in conflict.
Yeah, I'm sure that's something that a lot of our listeners will resonate with in terms of not being able to find the way to articulate what it is that maybe isn't working
Yeah.
in their private or their personal life. So how do you do that, Glenn, whenever you're talking to leaders and trying to help them, trying to coach them around dealing with those kind of issues in their professional life? You know, how does somebody who maybe is having a tough time at work talk about things failing?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is you've got to normalize it. I think we all experience, failure. We all experience disappointment. We've let ourselves down. We've let other people down. And so I think, trying to normalize that and help people not to feel judged for that failure or,
Yeah.
for something that they may blame themselves for, not to judge them, but to help them understand that this is something that many of us, if not all of us, experience at different times. And the real question is, how do we embrace that? How do we lean into that and begin to acknowledge that this is a very real part of life? It can be resolved, can be addressed, and that there are certain skills and strategies that can help us through that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, it's interesting hearing your origin story because for most people, the path is, success at high school, success through university, success in their early careers, and don't have that exposure
Mm,
to failure. You know, you talk about, you dropped out from school, you were there experiencing the failures in the social lives of others. You know, at the early part of your career. Do you think that's what maybe has given you a different set of insights? And if that's the case, then how do we learn from the way that you've developed to be able to learn faster in business to deal
mhm,
with failures whenever we haven't really got a kind of
mm.
a experience of that?
Yeah, no, thanks, John. It's interesting. I don't think we learn faster. I think, our lives are not linear. We're on it. Yes, we're on a journey, and part of the whole growth experience, the development experience, and overcoming failure. It's got to be felt. It's got to be learned, and you've got to really lean in and and press into that. I think for me personally, I went through a very difficult executive transition. It was something I struggled with enormously. I think at that point I'd experienced success, I guess, in the eyes of other people, and all of a sudden to go through a difficult executive transition where I felt let down, where I felt burned by people that I trusted. I think it helped me to begin to look at transitions differently, and particularly my work with leaders. We go through so many different transitions, one role to another role, and some of us don't transition very well. And part of the reason we don't transition well is because we don't adopt that learning orientation, which I understand is very difficult to do when we're going through something. The temptation is, let's just get through this as quick as we can and get through to the other side.
Mhm.
And I think that's normal. I mean, I think I felt the same thing. My thing was, I've just gone through a difficult transition. Let me go and find another job that I can go into and just overcome, get out of this season as quickly as possible. I think if I had have done that though, I would have missed an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity, really, to talk to many different people about their own experiences of leadership, their own experiences of transition, what worked for them, what didn't work, how quickly did they move through that, and so it taught me to be patient, and I'm probably not the most patient person, John and Chris, and I think when we're hurting, I think that's probably true for most of us. Let's just get through this as quickly as we can, and I think I came to understand that part of the gift, if you like, of failure and the gift of going through a difficult transition or a difficult time or an experience of disappointment is to actually lean into that and to learn from that and maybe to reframe that. It would have been tempting for me to have said, well, listen, I could have blamed somebody else. I could have taken the role of victim, or I could say, listen, there are things I could have done differently here. There are things that that I can learn from. What would I do differently? How would I, how can I learn from this? And I think that helped me to slow down a little bit and to really try and learn as much as I could. I began to journal through that time, write notes through that time as I spoke to different people, spoke to people that I trusted implicitly. I asked them for insights of their experience of me. What could I learn from their feedback about me and how I related to them and how I handled different experiences. And so I think largely, John, it just helped me to slow down and really take on that learning orientation and begin to reframe the experience that I went through so that I could use that as a catalyst for starting a new season in my life.
I was trying to count how many times you said the word learn there.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
I think that is absolutely the
Yeah.
key word. This idea of taking the time to reflect on why didn't that work, and to learn the lessons.
Mhm.
It's amazing how many leaders don't. They just bluster on to the next thing, forget about, put to one side, don't even want to talk about a failure, and move straight on to the next one. And that practice of journaling, I do a bit of mentoring, and I encourage people
Yes.
all the time
Yeah.
to reflect, to write down. My own personal practice,
Mhm.
I cycle to work, and on the way home, that 10-15 minutes that it takes me to get home, I use that time to reflect on the day, thinking about what went well. We all love to focus on that, but importantly,
Mm.
focusing on what didn't go well, thinking about why that was, and then
Mhm.
thinking what would I do differently. Karise,
Yeah.
what do you think as you listen to the story from Glenn and his narrative?
I think for me, Glenn and I've known each other now a number of years, that it really deeply resonates with me. Um, this idea of actually looking at failure as a really significant transition.
Mm.
And maybe that's what helps it be a comma, not a full stop. It is a transition. Um, but so Glenn, I know a little bit about your work in terms of Strengths Finder and all of that
Yes.
work. Glenn, you have come on to some of the boards that I've been on, and you've done incredible work. The team are looking at our strengths. If I could ask you, looking
Mm.
back to who you were before that, really, I know you've encountered a number of significant and profound transitions. How has failure really helped you develop your strengths even more? I'm thinking around, we're shaped by like how we're born, our personality, our nature, how we've been nurtured in some of the choices. But how has failure helped you on that journey of developing your strengths as a leader?
Yeah. That's a great question, really, when you think about it. I think most of us
Pretty
intuitively
profound.
have a really good understanding, of what our strengths are. But I think when I went through my own transition, Teresa, I probably began to look at my strengths a little bit differently. I know Gallup, with Clifton Strengths, they talk about their strengths. What are your top 5 strengths? And we do a lot of work around that. And one of the insights for me that was incredibly helpful, they asked the question. They look at your strengths when they're at the balcony, when they're operating at the balcony level, um,
That's right.
or how do they manifest themselves when you're not at your best? And that was just a little bit of an eye opener for me. So I began to think about that. I thought, well, listen, and if I take just the one of my strengths, and number 3 of my top 5 strengths is achiever, for example, and we all love that. Let's achieve, let's get results, let's get
I can relate, Glenn. I can relate. Yep.
yeah, let's tick that thing off the list, and so on. And I
Yeah.
think, we're fairly driven, and we're very results oriented. And that's a great thing. That's a really good thing. And that might be what it looks like when you're operating at the balcony, when you're operating at your best. But what does my achiever strength look like? How does that manifest itself when I'm not maybe in the best place, or when
Mhm.
I might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed or stressed or just not in a healthy place? And the reality is, because I am fairly driven and I like results, I like producing and making things happen. When I'm not in my best, sometimes what that allows me to do is I tend to burn other people around. It's like, let's keep going. We'll eventually get there. And it's not necessarily wrong, but it's the way that we exercise that spread. And so, if it's for yourself, it's okay. But all of a sudden, if you're with others and you're part of a team and you're in a role where you're having to lead other people, you know, I think it forces you to be thinking about how your strength actually comes across to them.
Mhm.
And I realized that there are times where I had to tone down that sense of drivenness and to think about, what does achiever look like here? And I think when you're going through or having had gone through a time of failure or disappointment or going through a difficult transition, to perhaps understand that to achieve is not necessarily get to the other side. To achieve is actually what's the best thing, what's the best lesson that I can learn from this single experience the most that I can carry forward for the rest of my life that's going to be incredibly valuable to me, but be something that I can use to encourage others. So it just gave me
Yeah.
the ability to look at my strengths differently.
Yeah, and I suppose that points to resilience. And John, I know you talk
Mm,
a lot about that connection and the choice around failure and resilience. And I'm just wondering for listeners
mm,
on this, Glenn, thinking about how would you help leaders avoid sort of collapsing into shame and collapsing into the full stop moment of failure when it maybe feels really personal? And you know this, Glenn, like in terms of the personal ramifications and even
yeah.
public, if we think, John, around some of the public leader narratives, how would you help leaders on that journey?
I love the words of that old sage, Ted Lasso. You know, you see,
I must say, I was not expecting
Ted
Ted Lasso.
Lasso.
he'll says, be curious, not judgmental. And I think that's a great statement. And, some often get asked, Glenn, how did you go through that difficult transition without swearing at somebody or throwing stones at somebody or, launching out or lashing out? And look, I'm not an expert on forgiveness at all, but I do know that forgiveness is incredibly powerful. And if most of my energy is holding a grudge against somebody else rather than releasing forgiveness, then I continue to give that person power over my life.
That's right.
And I know that's easier said than done. And please, to forgive, I think is still one of the most difficult things to do. But I think there comes a time where you've got to draw a line in that sand and say, look, um, was I hurt? Yes. Was I disappointed by somebody? Did somebody else live up to my expectations of them? And the answer is no. Could that transition have been handled differently? Yes. Okay. No matter how you answer all of those things, I think you can still say, all right, it perhaps wasn't the best, but at what point do I say enough is enough? Release forgiveness, claim back that power, and say, look, I can learn from this. And how do I make sure that, I don't allow something like this to happen again, or at least happen in the same way that it happened, because I can learn from this. And I think, your point on resilience, I think, is an important one, Carice. I think, resilience really comes back to what do you value the most in your life? And what are the values, for that matter, that are an integral part of who you are, your identity, and how other people see you? And I think if you're not clear on what you value the most and what values really characterize who you are and your identity, it's much more difficult to be resilient because you're kind of floating around, not sure who you are and how you want other people to see you.
Mhm.
Well, what can leaders do, Glenn? So you're talking there about, and I think you talked about this, Crease, in your preamble, these dark personality traits.
Yeah.
This temptation to blame others. To
Mhm.
it's not me, it's them. And if they do encounter failure in the non-delivery of a project or they don't get the promotion, leaders say, well, we can tend to say it's not me, it's somebody else. What can people do, or how do you encourage and coach people around dealing with those more complex issues and not trying to, as you say, blame others, but actually deal with the underlying problems? How should leaders consider that?
Yeah, there were a couple of things there, John. Manfred Ketz de Vries, I don't know if you've come across him, he's a great author, but he wrote a book called The Leadership Mystique. And in that, he talks about the dark side of leadership. And I found it incredibly confronting because he encourages you to think about what's the dark place of your leadership, that you don't want other people to see about you. And I thought that was really interesting. I want people to see the best parts of my leadership. I don't want them to see those dark parts of me that, that might get in the way of, how they think about me or how they view my leadership and my character, my identity. And so I think by acknowledging that we're not perfect, we're all learning, we're all trying, and I chose very early on to surround myself with a number of mentors in areas that were very different to areas where it wasn't necessarily representative of my expertise. And so I have five very different people. And when I traveled, for example, I gave them permission to ask me the most difficult questions, tough questions like, Glenn, when you traveled, did you put yourself, for example, in a compromising position with another woman? What did you watch on television? Was it healthy or unhealthy? Um, and I thought, well, these are pretty personal, pretty provocative questions. But what it did, it kept me accountable for my behavior and who I was. And I understand people can say, but you can lie. And of course we can, right? But if you've given people permission to ask you those questions, because the goal is for you to be a better person and a better leader and a person of great character that can be trusted, then I felt that to surround myself with people who could ask me any question related to my family, my relationships, my work, my leadership, personal decisions that I was making, it just gave me the ability to really tap into their wisdom, to their experience. And I got to tell you, to have the benefit of other people's wisdom from different walks of life has been incredibly powerful and transformative in my own life. And I often ask people, who's on your cheer squad? Who are the five people on your cheer squad? And not only that, who are the five people that you might be cheering on that desperately need you to cheer them on no matter what they're going through?
Yeah, and that latter is just so important in terms of all of our role as leaders, helping to create new leaders. I think that's a
Mm.
very powerful thought. Glenn, do you think we'll ever get to a place where we celebrate failure in the same way that we celebrate success?
Ooh, big question, John.
I hope so, John. I think it's really one of the reasons why I wrote the book When Leaders Are Lost. I think as you said, there's no shortage of books on success, five quick steps, three ways to engage, build a business. And for me, I was looking for something that was transparent, I think vulnerable, something that people could relate to. And again, even for people who perhaps they may not think that, they can relate to failure just yet. They're just starting out. Maybe they've not, had an experience of a difficult transition or not getting a job that they wanted or whatever. I think to encourage people to aspire and to dream, but also to be authentic about that and to realize that failure and disappointment and hurt is part of the journey of success. And I think to talk about success and not talk about these other things that are an integral part of building success, building a successful life and a successful platform. I think that's the greatest risk, that we don't do that. And so, I hope so, John. I really do hope that talking about failure and disappointment and hurt in leadership is something that we can all embrace and be willing to talk about and not be afraid to.
Yeah.
I certainly hope so. Karise, Illuminaire, your publication, it is all about bringing the science, the strategy, and importantly, the story to the leadership conversation. And that includes what we're doing
Yes.
here around the table. We've had Glenn speak,
Mhm.
but from your work, your research, what's your story on failure?
So whenever I was looking at the research on this, John, it was really fascinating. I obviously teach this in terms, and you've been on my executive MBA program, but when we actually look at the empirical evidence, what are the scientific studies? The reporting on failure really focuses on those effectuated failures during a specific tenure, like what are the outcomes around cash flow, fiscal measures, all of those is really around the shareholder perspective of what failure is. But whenever we actually look at the other causes of failure, the research is looking at the dark side. We talked about the sort of the narcissistic and the psychopath, those more psychological damages that can happen as a result of those really very significant failures. But in this grey zone that we've been talking about on this series, there are other unexpected reasons. And so the very recent work is actually, if we take, for example, MIT have just published some work on the effect of the pandemic on failure of leaders. So we're starting to come to terms with, well, actually, there's other organizational or environmental factors that actually play a part. Now, whenever we actually look at the sort of the wider aspects of our psychology as leaders, we need to know that we actually have this cognitive bias. And I think Glenn's story has touched on this, that sometimes we can think that other people's actions are failures, but ours as well, we can attribute that to something else that's happened to us. So I think the accountability that Glenn's talked about is important, and certainly the science is telling us that ability to be self-aware. So what do organizations, if people are leading an organization and listen to, what do they need to understand? The research is absolutely compelling on this, that the wisdom of learning from failure is unquestionable. So that's what the science is telling us. And yet, whenever we actually look at the evidence around this, it's very limited. And I started to look at the work of Amy Edmondson, a psychologist at Harvard University, and she's really talking about the role of the leader around that psychological safety. And that's back to the learning. How many times have we said this word? And that is the really important. And she talks about 3 different categories of failing, and she talks about there's failure that's preventable. There's failure that is, like what you said, very complex. And there's also failure that's intelligent. And it is actually all about how do leaders create that culture of safety where actually, in terms of that last question, is failure is actually acknowledged just as much as success. And it's detecting that and actually paying attention to that. And the reason that it's shortchanged, so many examples of it being that full stop, is because we don't actually go to those deeper, more unpleasant truths, the stuff that people don't see. It's the iceberg again, it's under the iceberg. And I think if we go there, the research tells us that's where it is truly transformative and for the better.
Yeah, and that's because it's difficult.
It's hard work.
It's hard work
Yeah.
to do that, and that's why it's important to think about the smaller failures and to
Yes.
take time now to reflect, to learn, to practice
100%.
failure, so that whenever you encounter something more significant, that we're equipped to be able to deal with it. You mentioned a number of publications there, as did you, Glenn, and references to those will be on the website for anybody who wants
Absolutely. Do a
to
deep dive.
go and read more about that. And as you say, the science is compelling around this, Karise, and we've explored some of the starting points for all of us as leaders to think about that word failure. Glenn, in all of our conversations around the table, we like to give our guests the last word. And so as we bring the podcast to a close, if there's a leader out there right now who is experiencing failure, where should they start when it comes to embracing failure as that comma that Karise said, rather than the full stop?
I'm going to use one word, John. It's called reframe. And the reason I use that word, in fact, it's the reason why I shared that artifact, that photo, when we started. Uh, as I mentioned to you, my mother, who was terminally ill in one hospital, my son was just born in the other hospital. My mother said, "I'd like to have a photo," and she had this amazing. You couldn't recognize her because of the chemical burns or the reaction to the chemotherapy that she had. And yet when she took Ben into her arms and we were about to take a photo, she said, "Make sure you get my good side." And, and that was incredibly impacting to me because what she'd effectively done is she'd reframed that situation. She could have focused on everything that was unpleasant about that situation. And she turned that around and said, "Make sure you get my good side. I've got this amazing opportunity to have a photo with my grandson." And I think in the same way, when we're going through failure or disappointment, or we find ourselves in an unpleasant situation, we're already looking at from the worst vantage point we can think of. And so my word is to reframe it. Is there a way that you can reframe that to give yourself a different perspective or insight about what you're going through? And that might even be something as little as, I wonder how somebody else would look at this same situation. I think this is how I'm seeing it, but how would somebody else look at this? I think this is unpleasant. Somebody else might say, "What a great opportunity." So just reframe that, and in reframing it, you have the opportunity to empower what is unpleasant to become incredibly transformative, or at least a catalyst to becoming transformative in your life.
What a powerful way to finish up the conversation around the table today. And that for me is the big takeaway,
Yeah,
reframe. So thank you so much for that. Your book is amazing. I encourage people to get out there, get a copy and read it, When Leaders Are Lost. Glenn's book, it's a powerful guide for leaders navigating setbacks and failure in their lives. Thank you so much for joining us down the line from Australia. Karise, thanks as always for your expert insights. And thanks everybody for listening to this podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Many thanks to David Glendenning, an artist from Northern Ireland who provided the soundtrack for this podcast show.